Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now. Welcome to Then and Now. My name is Maya Ferdman. I'm the producer of Then and Now and assistant director at the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. Our two guests this week are Professor Dalié Jimenez of UC Irvine Law School and Professor Jonathan Glater of UC Berkeley School of Law. Both Professors Glater and Jimenez are experts in higher education law and student debt policy. They co-authored the 2020 article, Student Debt is a Civil Rights Issue, the Case for Debt Relief and Higher Education Reform. They also co-founded the Student Loan Law Initiative at UC Irvine in partnership with the Student Borrower Protection Center. Professor Jimenez directs the center. Professor Jimenez's scholarly work focuses on contracts, bankruptcy, and consumer financial distress, the regulation of financial products and its intersection with consumer protection, and access to justice. She spent a year as part of the founding staff of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where she worked on debt collection, debt relief, credit reporting, and student loan issues. Professor Glater has taught education law and policy, criminal law and disability law, as well as business associations and classes on white-collar crime. He was previously professor here at UCLA Law and spent nearly a decade as a reporter at the New York Times reporting on these very issues. Welcome, Dalié and Jonathan, to the program.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So the student debt crisis has ballooned to astronomical proportions over the past decade. Over 46 million students in the U.S. currently hold over $1.75 trillion in debt, the vast majority of which is made up of federal student loans. The federal government froze repayment on these loans at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and extended this freeze 8 times since then. In the meantime, President Biden made a campaign promise to cancel at least part of said debt and is said to be making a final decision soon about whether to use his executive powers to do so. We are at what feels like an inflection point in the national conversation about student debt. But how did we get here? How did policymakers of the past lay the groundwork for this crisis? And how have those decisions impacted Black and Latinx students in particular? Dalié and Jonathan are particularly well positioned to address these questions, so let's dive right in. So your 2020 article makes the case that student debt is a civil rights and a racial justice issue. While the story starts in earnest with the passage of the Higher Education Act in 1965, you also name the nefarious role of debt in oppressing Black Americans throughout U.S. history. Why was it important for you to provide this historical context?
I think in order to understand the ways that has different kinds of effects on differently situated people, you have to understand those different situations at the outset. So the need to borrow obviously is not evenly distributed. When you use debt as a tool to make something accessible, not everybody needs to borrow. So if you don't understand that people enter the pursuit of higher education differently situated in socioeconomic terms, then you're missing some of the ways in which debt is particularly harmful to particular groups in the population. And in this country, we know that there's a long history of debt being a tool of racial and racialized oppression. And I think we quote in the article observations from W.E.B. Du Bois studying the post-Reconstruction era and the ways in which debt, the imposition of fines that there was no way someone could pay, fines deployed essentially to indenture Black people. So again, a tool of social control, a tool of oppression.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not just being able to understand the different contexts that people are coming from, but to understand that the very use of debt, it was instrumentalized. Can you say just a word on and how, in addition to what you named on W.E.B. Du Bois, what are some of those ways that it was instrumentalized?
Well, we know of the long history of redlining, right, in this country, right, in the context of home loans. So Black people would not have access to credit based on where they lived or where they were trying to buy And much more recently, we've seen instances that came to light after the Great Recession, or in the course of the Great Recession, really, where banks were charging higher interest rates to African American borrowers who were taking out home loans. There was a big settlement. There were several large settlements by financial institutions in relation to the terms on which they provided credit to people. So we've seen historically these debt functioning in these different ways. One, to create conditions really of debt peonage, one, to deny access to credit entirely, and one, to raise the cost of credit in racially disparate ways. So in any of those tools works to maintain or perpetuate subordination of the marginalized group. And I'm focusing here on Black people, but that's not the only context, I'm sure, in which debt is deployed in disparate ways.
So that's a valuable context to have when we're talking about student debt, which is a particular kind of debt. And we'll talk about some of the distinctions between student debt and other forms of debt in a little bit. But let's go into, where did student debt actually come from in this country? So the Higher Education Act of 1965 established two major approaches to the way that the U.S. finances higher education. It talked about tax credits and student debt. So why is this starting point significant? And what are the implications of this starting point for students of color in particular?
So we're going to talk primarily about student debt, but it is important to mention that this other prong of the way that Congress in 1965 begins to really in earnest invest in higher education is through tax credits. That is through, giving money back to people who spent money in higher education and who paid taxes, or who earned enough, to file a tax return, et cetera. So those credits are unevenly distributed, and they are much more likely to go to not the people, not the Black citizens and, other minority communities. They're much more likely to go to those who earn enough money to file tax returns, that is, the relatively wealthier populations. So that's one way in which, we finance higher education. And it's a costly way. In 2011, it was $25 billion. The numbers are not always reported, is another. So it's one that we often forget about. But then there's student debt itself.
So I want to clarify a little bit what I think you're asking, but tell me if I'm getting it wrong, because I think you used the word groundwork in talking about the Higher Education Act, and I'm not sure that I would characterize it quite that way, because really we have a situation of racialized socioeconomic inequality, and then we have the Higher Education Act plopped on top of that. As a tool, or it was described as a tool really to combat poverty, right? And to put higher education within reach of students who previously wouldn't have a way to pay for it, or would have to take out loans from banks with much more onerous terms. We could start the story earlier. We could start the story with the GI Bill, which was one kind of intervention aimed at servicemen returning from World War II. We could look at the National Defense Education Act, and I want to come back to that later. But the GI Bill is distinct in that it is described as this broadly available initiative, right? It's described in these very idealistic terms. If you look at the congressional record and see what lawmakers said, and I will footnote that I know there are those who will say, well, you can't take what members of Congress say at face value. We shouldn't be relying on these statements to draw conclusions about what the Higher Education Act or any other piece of legislation is actually intended to do. And I completely recognize and understand that. On the other hand, it seems to me that in this case, it's hard to identify the nefarious, cynical, true reason underlying this intervention. It's important, and we try to do this in the article, to note that the Higher Education Act could have taken different swipes at the problem of higher ed affordability. It included a grant program that at the time was pretty generous, and it got more generous into the 70s, right, to the point that it was covering most of the cost of attending a public four-year college or university. It's only since the 80s that the share covered by what was initially called these basic education opportunity grants has declined, right, as tuition has gone up and the grant amounts haven't kept pace. So all of this suggests a general approach to dealing with poverty and higher education access. What lawmakers did not focus on, and we can speculate as to why, is that poverty is different along lines of race. And the Higher Education Act doesn't take that into account. That's not what they were focused on. Even though if you look at the increases in the numbers of students going to college, first, the Higher Education Act has been a spectacular success, right? Millions and millions more students pursuing higher education than were previously. But at the same time, more and more of them are now saddled with debt, and disproportionately, it's Black and brown students who are saddled with debt because that's the condition before, right? That was their condition before they pursued higher ed. Dalié, I know you want to add something.
I mean, I think it's important to tie both questions together, the first question and this one together, to note, just to say explicitly, that, the Higher Education Act, like many of our laws, in fact, most of them probably, purports to be a colorblind law, right? It's just whoever wants to attend school, they need to fill out the FAFSA essentially, and then they can get these loans. That's where we are today. That, they used to be means tested in a sense, but it purports to do that. But especially when the vehicle is debt, and what you're doing is saying, now you have access to this debt. That is not going to be, as Jonathan started, like not everyone needs to take on debt in order to attend, a post-secondary school. So that's already a selection. And then that debt is going to be more onerous for some groups than others because of the just astronomical wealth gap that we have in this country between particularly Black and white people. And then you have a racialized, a racist labor market. And so then the idea here is that you're taking on this debt in order to go on and, have a great job and improve, sort of your lifestyle relative to your family. And that is correct, or apparently it's changing now too, but it's only ever been correct on average. It is not correct to say that that's what's likely to happen to the average, say, Black person. That's not actually, so just saying on average, we're really, just because of the numbers, we're really talking about for a white person. There's that improvement and, for the average white person. So it's a apparently colorblind law, but it is certainly not having that effect, unsurprisingly, given the context.
I just wanted to add that, there are virtues of debt to lawmakers, right? So initially the idea or the setup of the program was financial institutions would make the loans and the federal government would guarantee them. It's a little more complicated than that because there's state level entities involved in all that. But it means that the government doesn't have to come up with all that grant money. So it's an appealing tool, but it has precisely the regressive effects that Dalié just articulated, right? That it's only the people who need to borrow. And a lot of those people who need to borrow, Black and brown people, are going to earn lower wages. So repayment is more difficult and they come in with less wealth. So they need to borrow larger amounts.
And so it sounds like the water that we were already swimming in had these racial inequities embedded within them, the forms of racial discrimination in the labor market, the wealth gap, which has its roots way back in history, right? And the HEA had this intention of leveling the playing field or providing opportunity, was the language that you cited. And yet this quote unquote colorblind approach ends up exacerbating some of that inequity that was already there.
Yes.
And so I guess I wanted to follow up, Jonathan. You said that it's hard to identify sort of those nefarious elements underneath the HEA. And can I ask you to expand on that a little? You speak in the article a few times that these weren't the intentions, that where we are today is not the intention of the authors of the HEA, that Congress wanted, in fact, to increase opportunity. To what extent does that intention matter at this point? And what can we learn from those good intentions?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm tempted to answer not in the slightest, right? Like, who cares what their intentions were? Because now we have this structure that is simultaneously putting higher education within reach, but imposing these costs in disparate fashion on the people who we intended to benefit by setting it up in the first place. So I don't, at one level, I don't know that the intentions matter at all. But I do think, to the second part of your question, what we can learn from it, I think there's a sense of possibility in the language around the Higher Education Act. There is the conviction that the problem of equity and access to education at every level is something that we can solve. And that too often does not seem to be playing a role in our national debates over student debt. Student debt is just one tool. There are other tools that we could use, and I'll save the other point I want to make later. But there's a moral component to our discussions about debt that I'm sure we'll get to in a few moments. And I think that undermines the ability to step back and think about, what do we want to do when we have the possibility of the federal government intervening to make higher education more access? Like, if we start with that question, what do we get?
I like that answer. I'll just say it. I think I'm, total agreement, just slightly differently. Their intentions, their stated intentions were honorable. I don't know what their real intentions were, right? Like, and we do say in the article that those appear to be their intentions. That's what they said on the congressional record. So let's take them at their word. Expanding access, so that everyone who wants to pursue higher education can, and that we encourage it because we want more people to do that, because that is a public good. And so we should the government should expend resources to encourage this and to facilitate it. Those are great intentions. So they tried these interventions, the debt, the tax, to a much lesser extent, the Pell Grant equivalent. They worked to expand some access, not necessarily the completion type of access that we would like, so not as fully as possible. And they harmed many people quite dramatically at the same time. So I would say overall, not the greatest intervention. There are other ways we could do this. And at this point in time, what we can learn from it is, okay, that was not the best way to do this. So now we need to try something different. So in the larger conversation, I'm talking about student debt. This is why, the conversation often focuses on the cancellation argument, which we should definitely have. But the larger, bigger picture is, this was a mistake. Focusing on debt, expanding the debt program in this way, requiring essentially everyone who really needs the debt, who really needs, somebody to help them to afford higher education, to take that on as a debt, was a policy failure. So we need to recognize that and fix it, which means fixing it for the people who we have failed, all of the people we've harmed, and fixing it for the future, so that we don't just keep repeating the same mistake over and over again.
So it sounds like when we talk about intention, the HEA set forth this aspirational, philosophical, moral goal of access and education as a public good. And what you're arguing is that the policies that it implemented to fulfill that aspiration were a failure.
Not necessarily a failure, but counterproductive, right? In the sense that, so debt does mean people can borrow and go to college, colleges that they previously could not have afforded to go to. But there's a penalty that's attached, because there's this obligation to repay that can be devastating, right? And especially if students fail to complete, which we haven't talked about yet.
Well, let's talk about that penalty. Let's talk about the ways in which the harms that you're sort of alluding to. But let's really dig into those as they, because you laid out in your article numerous shifts since 1970 that contributed to the crisis that we're seeing today, including rising tuition, including rising dependence on these loans in order to access education, including wage stagnation and the rise of for-profit colleges, which is significant. So can you speak to what are the effects of all of these trends on students and Black and Latinx students in particular?
So the effects are, as one would expect, in the sense that these are populations that have lower wealth, dramatically lower wealth. And in fact, let's just say some numbers. I mean, the wealth numbers are, quite dramatic. So for example, the median wealth in the country was $81,000 in 2013, but the white median wealth was 1.5 times that. And the Black median wealth was 1/8 of that, $11,000. So, and this is, this obscures a ton of diversity, among those groups and groups that aren't typically named, like typically separated, like Asian or Native people, because we don't have enough numbers, for them. So it obscures a lot of diversity in that sense. So what ends up happening is that all of these things affect the groups you would expect disproportionately. They end up going, Black and Latino students are heavily overrepresented in for-profit schools. They are also heavily overrepresented in the no graduation, leaves without a diploma category, in the default category, in basically every category that is negative. They're overrepresented relative to their, percentage of the population.
So in the article, we talk about this concept of predatory inclusion, which is not, we didn't come up with it, but it's a useful, construct to use, especially in the context of student debt, which is inclusive, right, in that it makes higher education affordable for people who previously might not have been able to afford it, but it's also predatory because the tool makes that education available on terms that reduce its value.
Can you illustrate that for us? Maybe using either the example of for-profit schools, I think is a really compelling and sort of straightforward one.
So we know that the for-profit sector disproportionately targets particular populations, right? We know that Black people are overrepresented in the population of students who attend for-profit schools. Latinx students, I think, are also disproportionately overrepresented in the populations that attend for-profit schools. And we know that default rates are higher and completion rates are lower for students who attend for-profit schools. So they're obtaining something, the value of which is hotly debated, and I think it can vary from program to program, but the aggregate statistics with respect to for-profits are pretty devastating. That means that the students who are pursuing higher education via that path, too many of them are suffering the consequences of debt at the back end without a degree that accords them the financial benefit that would make it easier to manage that debt.
Okay, I want to jump in with just some numbers on the for-profit thing. So students at for-profit institutions who are overwhelmingly Black and Latino, because these institutions spend a lot of their revenue on advertisements to these groups and locations, their physical locations are literally created to get a larger share of people from these groups. So people who attend those institutions pay more for their education, in that it costs more, than community colleges, for as an analogy. They're more likely to borrow, and they borrow larger amounts than those attending a nonprofit or a public school. And so, for example, an associate's degree, a 2-year degree, usually 2-year degrees recipient at a for-profit school will borrow almost the same amount than a bachelor's degree, typically a 4-year degree recipient at a public university. Even though the number of courses required, is typically double for a 4-year bachelor's degree. And despite paying more in tuition, taking out more debt to afford it, they don't, these students at for-profit institutions don't experience better educational or labor markets. And I'm not an education person, Jonathan. So I didn't really know the fact that our, percentage or graduation completion rates in general are pretty abysmal. So the best 6-year completion rate for a 4-year degree, or what we would, a bachelor's degree. It's 65% of students graduate with a bachelor's degree within 6 years. That's at private nonprofit colleges. The number for for-profit colleges is 22%. So it's really, I mean, they're both bad. They're both bad numbers, and that 6 years, for completion is pretty bad. And some are even worse. So like University of Phoenix in 2019 reports, 17% graduation rates within 6 years. So they, when you don't graduate, you have the worst of all worlds. You've got the debt, sometimes for many years, and you have you probably haven't worked as much as you could have, given that you've been studying. And then you don't have anything to show for it. So, those are the students who then tend to have, the higher default rates. And so overall, since you have such low completion rates in the for-profit category, then it's unsurprising, given the people who are in these groups, who are going to these schools, who don't complete, it's unsurprising that they're going to have such dramatic differences in terms of their completion.
Which illustrates your point about predatory inclusion. This idea that you can access your education, but you're going to spend more. You're going to be targeted particularly for schools where you're going to spend more and are less likely to graduate and reap the benefits of said education. I'm wondering, how did these trends increased over the past many decades? But of course, 2008 was very significant. We faced the Great Recession and a sort of shift in the conversation about student loans. What was that shift? How did the Great Recession impact both the crisis and the conversation about the crisis?
So we know that student debt already has an effect on borrowers, myriad effects on borrowers, right? So the income shock of the Great Recession for students who graduated around that period meant that they put off buying homes, put off having children, put off major financial investments, things like that. So it can set student borrowers back. And again, disproportionately, it's going to set back those students who enter with less wealth, those students who confront labor markets that are going to pay them lower wages, right? So disproportionately, it's going to affect, again, your Black and brown students. So it's not that surprising that, once again, we have a general phenomenon, but it's going to have a disparate impact on differently situated borrowers.
So let's fast forward to today. You lay out numerous pathways for addressing the student debt crisis through the lens of civil rights, saying that access to education is a civil right. And first, you make an important distinction between student debt and other forms of debt, like mortgage loans. Namely, that students who take out the same student loans face the same terms, unlike other loans like mortgage loans. But that students of color face a completely different socioeconomic context and the ongoing racial discrimination that you named, sort of that water of racial inequity and discrimination that we talked about earlier. And you named that a proper remedy for this harm would be specifically targeted to redress past and ongoing wrongs incurred because of racism. So you published this article before the COVID-19 pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. How have these events influenced the conversation on the disparate impacts of student debt on people of color, as well as their potential remedies?
I have been pleasantly surprised about the public conversation. And maybe it actually did begin with the Occupy movement during the Great Recession. This conversation of turning back the tide on, or going back to first principles of not just assuming because a person has debt, there's something, they made that choice, there's something wrong with them, and looking beyond that individual to the larger picture of this is actually a policy choice that numerous governmental administrations and Congresses, et cetera, presidents have made. And it is not a policy choice that we necessarily need to live with. And it is also not one that is it's one that has whatever, as we talked about earlier, the intentions were, it has not had a good result. And so I think that just all of the events, all of, and, I would even say the climate crisis, like just all of these things that are going on and are leading many people to say these things out loud in a way that I think I wouldn't have thought possible in 2018. And that's a positive. That's a huge positive. Regardless of, being sometimes, at least me being sometimes frustrated about how far we've actually gotten when you get politicians to even say some of these things out loud, but yet not to do anything about it. But separate from that question, when you started with the whole, redressing the harms, I don't know if you want to talk about, because we do mention in the article about, reparations and how this is there's sort of a larger conversation here. We don't necessarily have to talk about it. I just wanted to mention it.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up to what you just said. So there's also a larger conversation about reparations that has arisen also out of this movement for racial justice. It was existing before, but it's really reached prominence in the last couple of years. And you name that need for reparations. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I've taken out of this sort of all of these movements, the Debt Collective, the Occupy, all the movement for Black Lives, all of it has been that we should be bold and we should think about how do we get, what kind of society do we really want to live in, and how do we get there? And reparations, as I think we say in the article, is probably the bare minimum of fixing the original sin, the original wrong of slavery in this country. It does not fix the student loan problem. It fixes, or at least it ameliorates. It doesn't even matter actually to me if it fixes quote unquote, problems. It is like, you did a wrong thing. You need to attempt to repair it. So it is a larger conversation, that and just specifically policies that specifically would target the effects of the original wrong is what we should be doing. For various reasons we describe in the article, legal reasons, decisions of the Supreme Court, appears to be not an easy path to take.
So let's go into some of the other solutions that you outline. And you really take two approaches in the article. First, laying out an argument for a bold shift, and you said boldness, right? You really highlight that boldness in the government's approach to higher education and investment in higher education. And then you lay out some specific reforms to current practices. So can you, in brief, sort of outline some of these solutions for us in both of those categories?
We don't go into a lot of specifics about how this would work because it could be incredibly complicated and a legislative process would lead to all kinds of negotiations that we can't possibly anticipate. But what we describe is the possibility of a dramatically expanded federal funding role with respect to higher education, which could take the form of money to states or money directly to public colleges and universities. And even that, right, is a potentially controversial move. One thing that's important to recognize about loans is they let the student decide what school they want to go to, and it can be public or private, nonprofit, or for-profit. And what we're talking about would be directing funds to public colleges and universities, the schools that are, I think nearly 3/4 of students actually enroll at. So the idea of that would be to reduce tuition costs to zero for students, because we haven't really talked about this because we face two problems, right? One is this vast pool, the $1.7 trillion figure that gets thrown around all the time. But the other is the ongoing funding challenge, right? So even if there's some degree of cancellation that I'm sure we're getting to, that doesn't fix the system that depends on the availability of federal student loans. So it's really two steps in the process that we would want to see. One is cancellation of this existing pool of debt because it was a policy mistake, as Dalié articulated, and then a fix so that there's not just a new pool of debt that starts growing. It's like hitting the reset button. That doesn't solve it.
So let's talk about cancellation, because that debt cancellation, that's one of the biggest national conversations right now. We're waiting for Biden to make a decision about that. And I guess what you're saying is that it's necessary. It's a necessary fix based on the mistakes of the past to cancel this debt completely. And then one of the arguments that often goes is, well, what next? So can you speak a little bit to what are some of the major points of resistance to debt cancellation? And then also a little bit to that what next question.
But funnily enough, one of the major points of resistance is that there isn't an immediate what's next, because one of the sort of beauties of the moment that we find ourselves in is that we and many people think that the president has the power to cancel a lot, if not all, of student loan debt, or at least, a lot, if not all, of the student loan debt. So without going to Congress, and Congress cannot seem to do very much on any topic, even important ones. The president can do this. So the reset button thing, the president can do unilaterally today. So that's one reason to sort of push for, at the very least, let's fix that, right? Then it would take all of Congress to take many steps to fix the other problem, the ongoing problem. And that is something that we should definitely do. But that is something that requires a lot more people. It's a lot more complicated. So there's no reason, if we think that this was a mistake, like dragging it on doesn't, it just, there's no reason to do it if you don't have to. So that's one of the arguments, though, is that, fixing it, if Biden erases $50,000, $75,000, whatever, from, the balance books of all these people, and all of a sudden, a lot of the 44 million become not student loan borrowers at all. Like, they don't have a debt anymore. Then, people are going to take on, like, you literally hear this, we're going to take on more student loan debt so that they can, because they think they're going to get it erased too in the future. To which I say, yes, they should. And yet, it's a rational thing to do, because this should not be our system of funding. And so it's very myopic to say a lot of the objections to cancellation are, kind of like myopic and rude in that they essentially are like, oh, the world has always been like this, and so it will always be like this, which is not at all, right? Like, so it has to be this way. There will be also this amount of debt we're going to drive up, and then we will, I guess, erase it. If we erase it once, we will erase it again. But maybe we should just like not get into the cycle again. And maybe cancellation will be the thing that kicks us into not, at least one of the arguments against a cycle. And the root argument is what about the people who already paid off their debt? Doesn't everybody have to deserve or require? Shouldn't we require everyone to suffer? Which is just rude. Like, I mean, no, just because other people suffered, we made a mistake, we should try to fix it. If there are ways to help those people too, who already paid off and who are in trouble for some reason, like, that's a different argument rather than saying like they suffered and so the other people should suffer as well.
Yeah, the three objections that I think I hear the most are just cost. The moral hazard problem that Dalié just described, right? The idea that once debt is canceled, people will go out and borrow more and get more education. And the problem with that argument is that it's suggesting it's more than they should, but the justification for whatever the right amount of education that people should finance, that's always fuzzy, right? And the one thing people fall back on is, well, how much money are people going to make if they pursue a particular course of study in order to be able to pay off their loans? And I'm not sure that should dictate what young people or any age people, right, student borrowers do. And the third one is the argument that it's regressive, right? We were talking about this just the other day. The idea that it's regressive, saying people who have larger balances, student loan balances, are more likely to be people who have pursued advanced higher ed, right? Of medical school, law school, graduate programs, things like that, and they're going to tend to earn more money, and therefore we shouldn't be subsidizing them, right? They're gonna, it's like the fear of the free rider, and the problem with that is another one that Dalié already articulated, not in this context, which is, even if that's true in the aggregate, it's certainly not true with respect to each and every borrower, right? There are borrowers with large dollar balances who are really, really struggling. There are borrowers with large dollar balances who are associates at, law firms making huge salaries. The fact that student loan cancellation would benefit both is not a reason not to do it.
There's also, I just, I don't have it right in front of me, so like we can look more. If anyway, there's a few things about this argument of regressivity. One is that it's based on comparing incomes or thinking about people's incomes, and incomes are volatile, and they also don't really give you. You would not really say that someone is rich because they have a high income, or that literally, rich is about wealth. Like, what is their relative wealth? And saying that someone just graduated from, say like a Black student who comes from a lower middle class family, goes to law school, pays a lot of money, gets a big law job, they're going to make a lot of money. That is not the same. That person is not in the same situation as someone who came from an upper middle class school, even if they borrowed the same amounts. The sort of, if there is an unemployment period or a health problem or anything, those issues are going to affect those two individuals very differently. So we can't look at income. We should be looking at wealth. And when we look at wealth, we see that a cancellation is not regressive at all. In fact, it's progressive. It disproportionately affects the lowest wealth individuals who borrowed, because it is the lowest wealth individuals who had to borrow. And that the more cancellation we do, and Charlie Eaton and Fred Wary, Laura Hamilton, and I forgot the fourth person, did a report on this, which I think is, really what we should be citing when we talk about this stuff, is 10,000 is progressive, 50,000 is dramatically more progressive. And here progressive, I mean affecting the groups that have the lowest wealth, and also in turn also affecting Black and Latinx borrowers more, both of those things. And 75,000 is even more progressive. Of course, if you wipe it all out, everyone is, has no student loan debt. But because of the composition of people who have student loan debt, that itself is also progressive when we look at wealth.
So as we move towards conclusion, it's worth naming that your proposed solutions sort of toe this line in some ways between what is and what should or what could be, between that desperate and moral need for boldness in the face of decades of inequity, as well as the need for incremental reforms in the face of a really complex and layered and sort of embedded system. So in brief, before our final question, can you speak to the seeming tension? And how does that tension inform this discourse, both on student debt, but also on racial justice in general?
I think in the context of cancellation, especially right now where there are different dollar amounts being thrown around, right? I think I just read another newspaper article this morning that cited the $10,000 cancellation figure with an income cap of 125,000. I can't remember which newspaper I was reading that in. One of the fears I have is if that step or something like that is taken, that momentum for something broader is destroyed. And the possibilities are really exciting, right? I mean, also in the newspaper, within the past few weeks, we had the announcement from New Mexico about eliminating tuition at its public universities, period. So that's going to be a great experiment to watch, right? To see whether, does the sky fall if you make it free? Do too many people go to college? I mean, it makes me smile even to mention it, but are too many people going to pursue higher education if the cost is eliminated? And I hope that it will still be possible to have a conversation about going beyond, right, eliminating a swath of this current pool of student debt, maybe beyond raising Pell Grant amounts, although those are hugely important, right, and will benefit people in concrete terms. But it's the structure that we really wanted to draw attention to in the article.
Writing this article, which we did over 2019 in particular, and at the time that we did so, I have to say, radicalized me in terms of this tension. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, in terms of this tension about, being bold or being like, we're academics. So it is, not the case that you generally say academics are like bold and propose things that are out there, etc. Like we generally, it's incremental, possible things that could really occur. And to me, the tension is 100% there. I don't know the answer other than, one can imagine a world in which we get to good places through incremental reform. But I think that is not the world we have lived in. That is not what has happened in this world. And when you begin at only advocating for incremental reforms, then you're never going to get more than that, because no one goes from like, hey, let's do this tiny thing to like, now let's do something very dramatic. So I think it's even as an academic, I think it's important to try to propose a thing that would have the possibility of actually like making major change, understanding that is not what may happen. But that first we need to view the world or envision the world in which that major change occurs and see what that might be like.
Well, on that aspirational note, let's close out with a final question. Looking ahead, we're waiting for President Biden's announcement. We're on the cusp of a possible recession, and we are almost to our midterm elections. We're heading in that direction. What can we learn from the past, and what is your hope for the future?
I hope we think big. I really hope we think big. And the reason I say that is, so the National Defense Education Act, which we didn't talk about much, but before the Higher Education Act, there was the National Defense Education Act, and it was passed after the then Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and it created this panic that we're going to lose the space race. And then we're going to lose the Cold War. We're going to lose everything. We need to invest in education so that we can win in all these different dimensions. And so there's this pretty sizable investment in making higher education accessible out of concern over this global competition. And today I see us facing at least 4 tremendous challenges, right? So there's a medical public health crisis that looks like it's going to be ongoing. There's global warming. There's military threats, a land war in Europe. Who would have thought? And then increasingly, as you noted, right, we recognize the legacy of racial inequality in the country, and we have to grapple with how to address it. So that seems to me to suggest we need to be investing an awful lot more than we have already, because we're going to need some really smart people, really well-educated, smart people, to get us through all of these.
I don't know that I could say it any better. So I can, thinking about these issues that can be very depressing, especially now. I'm glad that we're having the conversation that there may be cancellation soon. I had hoped we'd have that conversation 2 years ago. I don't, it's unclear why it's taken this long, but hey, we're here. This is what we're at. So what is my hope for the future? I think we need to, and I hope, and I would have said this 2 years ago, but that we need to take bold action that actually attempts to solve the real problems that we have. It won't solve all the problems. It may create new problems. That's just the nature of change. But incremental or defense kind of change is not going to get us anywhere good. So my hope for the future on this topic, and actually many others that, gun control, like all sorts of other topics, is that we actually, those who are currently in charge of our government actually commit to doing something different that is attempting to remedy the problems.
Well, thank you both for laying out the argument for this kind of bold change. And also thank you for your time, Professor Jonathan Glater and Professor Dalié Jimenez. Thank you on behalf of all the audiences of Then and Now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support. And thanks to you for listening.